Thank you, Jason. Good morning. This is not your usual economic update, but then again, 2020 wasn't your usual year. Nor is it a presentation about money particularly. Economic theory and the basis of money as we understand it, I think, has been superseded by something else, something different, and that is data. Who needs economic models if you are able in real time, real data on the world's population to understand their decision-making processes? Who needs money if digital currencies issued and taxed by the government are presented to large parts of the population? So I'm going to talk about data. But first, a digression. I, like probably many of you, have spent the last 12 months or so staring into screens and doing business through screens. Some of my partners and colleagues, I think, consider me to be a bit of a Cassandra. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, Cassandra, the Greek goddess, the daughter of Troy, famous for her prophecies. Now, her prophecies were often right, but they were always doom-laden and negative, and that meant that people didn't believe her. So, why am I a bit of a Cassandra? Well, Jason's already alluded to national debt, but this is the reason. I wouldn't say that nationaldebtclock.co.uk was on my homepage, but it is a page I look at occasionally. And with debt growing at over £5,000 per second, by the time I finish talking to you, that will be 3 million quid. That's something to feel fairly negative about, I would suggest. And if you look at national debt and you look at it in the context of the period after the credit crunch, but before COVID, you see that debt did actually increase. But also the size of the economy increased as well. And what that meant is that GDP, the productivity of the country as a proportion of debt, stayed more or less consistent between 83 to 87% during that time. But if you set that against the context of yesterday's announcements, you can see the OBR figures that have been confirmed to the end of March show that debt increased in just that 2-year period by £412 billion. What's interesting about that 2-year period and the OBR forecasts after that is that debt is projected to further increase by over £100 billion each year for the rest of the cycle of the budget. What struck me from that is that this is no one-off thing. This is a structural thing. And if you look at debt as a proportion of GDP, you can see that the 83 to 86% during those periods of so-called austerity, that's gone up to 85, 100, and then in 2024, 110%. So 25% structural increase. And really, we're in a position now where debt is more than 100% of GDP. Now, what's interesting about that is based on some fairly positive forecasts in terms of return of the economy in coming years as well. Let's explore this a little bit further. Now, I have to say I fixed this graph because I added 2 columns for the fiscal year to 2022, but I can't put the columns on there for 2024 because I don't have the availability on my y-axis. What you can see from this graph is very clearly that period before the credit crunch when debt was at around 40% of GDP. We then had something that happened. That was the credit crunch, and that led to mass printing of money, quantitative easing, and a structural change to our economy. But 10 years after that, we lived through a period where GDP and debt was relatively consistent as a proportion. There was some stability. The debt was never paid down, but at least it was serviced. It's a bit like having an interest-only mortgage, where you don't draw down any more capital, but you are able to service the interest. What happened in last year is something else, COVID. I think that this will similarly prove to be structural. And what Rishi said yesterday was, despite tax rises to tackle the deficit, he talked about tackling the deficit. So there's no question about tackling the debt. This is going to be here for the long term. It's here to stay. Those that know me know that this is one of my favourite slides. This is historic bank rates. Now, it actually goes back 300 years. To the 1700s, and save a little period at the end of the 80s, it was more or less consistent between 4 and 6% until the credit crisis, when the money was printed, the cost of money therefore decreased. I sat through many, many Bank of England presentations in the subsequent decade, and the projections that the Bank of England gave are shown on that slide. Always the same message: interest rates will increase. Do you know what? They never did. And so that was a structural change to our economy. This is a relevant slide in the context of the debt that I just talked about, because a 1% increase in the base rate, that increases the repayments on the debt by something like 25 billion. If you have 2.5 trillion of debt, then that's the sort of numbers that we are talking about. And that is what Rishi is really concerned about. So why was that structural interest rate built into the economy? I gave some thought to this yesterday, and I think with any emergency financial measures, it seems that the crisis used to justify them never ends. And despite the promises of various Bank of England presentations, they could never bring themselves to get back to what they considered to be normal rates of interest. So I'm wondering now if it will follow that the furlough scheme we currently have will steadily become a permanent part of Britain's welfare infrastructure. Do you know, if you've been on furlough since last March and you're still on furlough in October this year, you have to ask the question whether or not that job really exists. And I wonder if this is a next step to some sort of universal income. And that's where data and technology comes in, because clearly that is replacing a lot of jobs in the economy. Anyway, the last time we actually met over sausages, I presented this slide. I always like to have a bit of a go at the government, and I was banging on about how the government controls our lives. There are two main ways, two main levers. It can print money and it can levy taxes. And boy, didn't we see both of those in terms of the last year, but also the announcements yesterday. I'm adding an additional point this year to this slide, and that is data. I think the government has finally twigged what Silicon Valley twigged 20 years ago, that there's such power in data. And I'm going to look at data in the past, present, and future. Now, personally, as an accountant, I blooming love a cash flow statement, because a cash flow statement does not lie. It is absolute. Cash in, cash out, net position. You can't cheat or fiddle a cash flow statement. That's why we say cash is king. Cash is the blood of a business. You live or die by cash. And I think there is an analogy between the cash flow statement and what we've seen over the last year. And this is the only time I'm going to talk about coronavirus. And if you look at life and death, and you look at the Office for National Statistics and the crude mortality rates, you can see that over the last few hundred years, this is what has happened: deaths per 100,000. During the mid-1800s, you had the germ theory. Doctors would start washing their hands. They didn't previously. That led to massive improvements in mortality. You can see the spikes there: World War I, World War II. And then if I blow up that last 30 years or so, crude mortality rates, including 2020, you can see towards the end of the 2010s, you had some massive improvements in medical science. You know, cancers that 10 years ago wouldn't have been possible to treat, people now survive from. So that is where the 2020 mortality is in the context of those recent death rates. Now, I don't want to get into a comment as to whether or not that is significant or not. That is a very political debate. You might think that it could have been a lot worse had the government not taken measures, or you might think that the whole thing has been overblown. I will leave it hanging there. The point I want to make is that sort of data is what is informing politics at the moment. Data is political power in a way that it never has been previously. What about data present? I often get asked by business owners, how much is my business worth? What we have seen towards the end of last year is a bifurcation. There's a report recently issued by Deal Suite that looks at the average price the market is paying for businesses. And what's interesting about that is that some businesses, the ones that won last year, the market is now paying a little bit more. Some businesses, those that lost last year, the market is paying less. Overall, it averages, it's something like 5.4 times earnings, but you have this bifurcation. And if you look at that a little bit closer, you see that bifurcation is by sector. And my theory is you have data light sectors and data heavy sectors. So data heavy sectors, look there, IT services, health and pharmaceuticals, e-commerce, they are higher multiples, they're bifurcating upwards. Data light sectors, trade, engineering, hospitality, they are bifurcating downwards. You're seeing that division. Now, this also provides opportunity, doesn't it? Because there is perhaps a way of introducing data into some of those data light sectors. And that's the sort of thing we're talking to our clients about. Will this ever correct? I don't know if it will ever correct. I think this is a permanent structural thing. And I think the way in which businesses use data is going to contribute to their valuations. What about the future? Well, let's learn from the Cassandras of the past. I picked an article out from the Daily Mail, not a newspaper that I read very often. Back in 2000, that was the headline. The internet may just be a passing fad as millions give up on it. We can learn from that, and we can learn and take inspiration from those who got it quickly. Do you know, I remember this story. I don't know if you do. But back in 1994, there were a couple of consultants who were paid a small fee to trial the club card for Tesco's. And they took their findings into the boardroom, presented them, and were met by that horrible silence. And the silence was broken when Lord Ian Maclaurin, the chairman at the time, said, "You seem to know more about my business in 3 months than I have learned in 30 years. What he did with Terry Leahy was take those lessons and use the data from the club card to turn that business. The subsequent 20 years, history proved it dominated the sector. So there is a positive lesson that you can learn. Just in wrapping up, I would say that we are living through a revolution. Whatever business, whatever sector you are in, you are going to be affected by this. 4G to 5G is going to mean more connectivity, more automation, and digital transformation, disruptive technologies. Robotics, artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, they are already part of everyday life. Hey Siri, data is the new currency. So they're my thoughts. Data is a store of value, it is the currency, it's driving government power, it's driving valuation multiples. You need to think about where it can be used, where it applies in your business. Data is relevant to the way we're working from home. So work is now what you do and how you use data, not where you go to. And finally, I would say, get some people in your business who were born after that Daily Mail article in 2000. Get some Generation Zs in your business, because these are people who have been born, who have grown up in the world of technology and in the world of data. And they get this far more than anybody else. Thank you very much.